Before we formally start the webinar, first of all, I would like to acknowledge that the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, where this webinar is being hosted, is based on the UBC Point Grey campus, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. You may be joining us from traditional lands across British Columbia, Canada, and the world. And we would also like to acknowledge the owners and caretakers of those lands as well. If you want to express your own land acknowledgement, you're encouraged to do so through the chat box. Maybe before we go into the specific topic, which is really important and interesting for today's discussions, I want to just give you a bit of a background about the IOF webinar. The IOF webinar is designed to provide some current discussions of some of the emerging and important current issues related to oceans and fisheries. We started the IOF webinar series since last September and kicked it off with the heat wave, and particularly the heat wave that we experienced in British Columbia, which had a big impact on both people and the oceans. And then after that, we had various webinars that follow on the various events and issues over the years, such as focusing on the restorations of Pacific salmon. We had just the recent one that looked at how the role of subsidies in marine conservation and fisheries management, and how we can deal with that. And today we have the another very important topics that I think relates to many issues that are directly or indirectly related to the oceans and fisheries, which is on conflicts and different types of conflicts, and how that relates to environmental change and politics, economics, and other societal issues. So I will stop here, and I will pass the floor and the mic to Professor Philip LeBron, who is helping in the organization's coordination and leading of this specific webinar. So please, Philip.
Yes, thank you very much, William. And I added my own acknowledgement on the chat box. So thank you all for joining today. At the initiative of William, he invited me to do a webinar on the theme of maritime and fisheries conflicts. I apologize a little bit for the title, Fish Wars and Blue Conflicts. It's a little bit maybe too crude, but the idea was a little bit to reflect on the situation in the world around those issues, in particular in the triggered a little bit by the context of the military assault on Ukraine, and in particular what we've seen along the Sea of Azov, the port city of Mariupol, of course. Russian fighters entering also Swedish airspace near the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea. All this has also highlighted that the military force is still being used, that war is still around. Of course, it's touching people here in the West more than usual, because it feels like a near abroad, but those wars have taken place in many other places. Of course, we don't always think about fishing, when we are looking at the case of Ukraine, but it's important to put that in the broader perspective of thinking, okay, well, what have we learned over the past 10, 15 years around fisheries conflicts? And what can we be doing in this regard, as an academic community? So we'll have a number of panelists here, but before going there, I'd like to highlight just a few issues that highlighting key things. So first one, I wanted to say that fish wars, it's mostly a war on fish. The main victims here are the fish. So if you take a little bit of a post-human approach on this, every day billions of fish are being killed and consumed, and so of course we cannot equate all these things. but it's important to remember that we don't always consider fish as sacred, as in the sense of sacredness of life, as much as we should. There's a lot of boats out there in many places. We've seen a very important rise in the industrialization of fishing, which has led actually to the depletion or the over-harvesting of some of the stocks out there. So these things are well known. The industrial fishing, especially in distant water fishing style, is dominated by a number of countries, and China first among them, followed by Taiwan, Korea, and Spain, and others. So not only are we fishing in more places, but we're also fishing more frequently. So there's a lot of research that indicates that the intensification takes place not only across space, but across time. Seasonality is being eradicated in some ways also. So fishing to the bottom, of course, is a major theme, as you know, at the IOF, and has been documented extensively. So it's difficult to always relate, fish depletion with fisheries conflicts, and I don't want to make very simplistic statements here, but conflicts among fishers, between fishers, and between fishers and authorities are very common. There are many reasons over this. Sometimes they're as broad as a question of ownership. Are these fishing grounds in this country or that country? Access rule between different types of fishers or modes of conservations, etc. Gear type is also very frequent, especially between industrial and artisanal, because the industrial gear type tend to first damage, for example, with bottom trawling the ecosystem much more than some artisanal means. At the same time, some artisanal fishers are using dynamite, which is also not that great, of course. Okay, and seasonality is also important sometimes. Here you've got, in my own little turf in Brittany, in France, the scallop war that opposed different types of fishers in the Bay de Seine, for example. The season being relatively short for the French, but not for the British in that particular case. Issues around quotas, the character of quotas, individual ownership of quotas, individual transferable quotas, for example, that have been monopolized, meaning that some people are actually very much in control of fisheries and turn fishermen who used to be artisans into essentially subcontractors with very little opportunity for profit, which leads some of them to go into more illegal type of behavior in order to make a little bit more money. And of course, marine space itself is being disputed because fishing is not the only activity out there. And so conflicts between local fishers and tourism-based activities, for example, is also quite common. So a number of people, and in particular Jessica Spiker, a very good colleague of us, have done work in order to understand the trends and the character of these conflicts. So at the international level, there's really a new spike that has come up after the 2000s, and that followed a spike that was more concentrated, in between, for example, the US and Canada, while the current one is very much centered on Asia and the distant fishing water fleets of certain countries like China and Taiwan, as I mentioned. The same people have tried to, identify the number of factors that may influence the future fisheries conflicts that we may see around the world. So I point at you a paper, again by Jessica, led by Jessica, on exploring the future of fisheries conflicts through narrative scenarios that looked at different regions, and in particular the East China Sea, which is one. And as you will see, there's lots of factors involved: geopolitical, declining stock, pollution, level of fishing efforts, demand for seafood, etc. The latest paper, and I'm too bad that Jessica is currently traveling, so she cannot participate. But the latest paper, in trying to identify the factors, find that it's actually demand for seafood more than scarcity in itself that seems to be behind many of these conflicts. In part because domestic scarcity is leading, distant fishing waters, vessels abroad, and that results in more conflicts. So fishing is not the only source of tension and conflicts in the seas. Of course, we've seen what has been termed by Geoffrey as the blue acceleration across many sectors. agriculture, fossil fuel, deep sea mining is really trying to take off, and we'll see probably the code coming up within 2 years. Tourism is also very intense on the coast. At the same time, there's a lot of conservation efforts. And so all this is putting a lot of pressure. Many different stakeholders are becoming involved. So again, if we wanted to do a little bit of an oversimplification, but if we're looking at the factors that may exacerbate fish wars and blue conflicts, we can go at, think about this so-called blue acceleration, fisheries depletion, geopolitical tensions. The world is not, geopolitically as constructive and stable as it was in the 1990s, at least among major powers. And I'll talk in a moment also, and I think Maurice will come back to that, we talk about securitization. So there is an effort by governments in particular to bring more maritime security, but it has also counterproductive impacts. And of course, the problem of climate change, which is changing a lot of things. And William has done, of course, fantastic work on fish migration in this respect. All is not bad, however, because there is, we can say, more scientific and policy cooperation to a degree. There is also more institutionalization. And there are efforts for co-management and what is called for land conservation, convivial conservation, meaning bringing more issues about social justice, involving local communities into efforts towards conservation. So that also helps, a great deal. When we look at the number of conflicts around the world that involve and mobilize fishers, the Environmental Justice Atlas has identified about 740 of them. So some are inland, many are on the coast. If you've got a keen eye, you will, of course, see that a lot are actually in coastal areas of Southeast Asia. There's also a high concentration around, of course, the Niger Delta with problems around oil here. As well as in Latin America and the Caribbean. But every region of the world is affected pretty much by that. And the main factors have been essentially industrial fishing. So a lot of artisanal communities that constitute those groups that often mobilize themselves are against it. Industrial pollution, new mining and energy. In my own region, it's a wind farm that has pitted basically a major project that has pitted fishermen against the government and the wind farm company. And we see a lot of dispossession and displacement, as I mentioned, either by conservation, tourism project, land extension, restriction, new port infrastructure. So the blue economy is having also quite a lot of impact. I will not detail very much the factors that climate change can bring into the equation. There's an excellent paper by Mendel and Colin Hendricks has participated in it that explores those dimensions. I just highlight them here. And as I mentioned, securitization can have some counterproductive impacts. The main one is that as government authorities are hardening security at sea, trying to tackle illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, they can sometimes target in a quite biased way small-scale fishers that are really out there more for basic livelihoods, and that affects families, etc. As I mentioned, there are also exclusionary forms of marine conservation. So the overall goal, I think, is generally shared within our communities, trying to protect small-scale fishers, coastal communities, and food securities. And what we are seeing maybe is a cycle in the most extreme cases, like places where I've started work, like in Colombia and Ecuador, where we see that destructive illegal industrial fishing can increase levels of piracy. We see anti-IUU measures that often hurt artisanal fishers. Artisanal fishers then sometimes have to turn towards smuggling or piracy that sometimes affect other fishers within the community, making it for very complicated relationship within these communities. And it's not always clear who the authorities side, because at different levels, you've got, authorities that can be at local level working in collusion with some of these groups, etc. So overall, I'll conclude a little bit with something that Christian Berger has been exploring in his new paper called A New Framework for Cross-Paradigmatic Ocean Policy and Research. He's trying to build synergy across ocean governance paradigms. So there are different people out there with different views of what the ocean, how the ocean should be managed, etc. From a very mainstream, hard maritime security to business-driven blue economy, to biology-driven ocean health, emphasizing conservation, etc., to notions of blue justice, who are really putting the emphasis on questions of equity, fairness, and the protection of traditional coastal communities. So after this little introduction, I hope it was not too long, I will introduce briefly the panelists. So we're really lucky to have a number of great people. Dr. Kellen Hendricks is professor at the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's done a lot of work on the impact of climate change, on conflict, on also the oil curse, etc. But he has done some very interesting work on fisheries in recent years, and currently looks at the management of fisheries conflicts in the 21st century, and looking at the role of regional management organizations. We have Sarah Glasser. Dr. Sarah Glasser is director of Secure Fishery at One Earth Future. She has done extensive work over many years on fisheries conflicts around the Horn of Africa, and in particular Somalia. She is also the founder of the Fisheries Conflict Research Consortium, which brings researchers and practitioners examining these issues. We have Dr. Maurice Obaseng, who is a research associate at the University of Sheffield, who's done a lot of work on maritime security and the securitization of fisheries in the Gulf of Guinea, and in particular in Cameroon. And we have Dr. Louis Stade, who is a research associate at the Institute of Oceans and Fisheries at UBC. She's very interested about a number of things, and in particular, she has worked with a lot of people on many aspects of fisheries. One of the latest reports, and this one she will be talking about, has been looking at the unsustainability of fisheries practices in the East China Sea, and the problem that this causes to the likelihood of conflicts and the potential of co-management. So I will stop here.
Greetings. Over the next few minutes, I'll be introducing you to some of the work that my team and I have been doing on the interstate security implications of climate change for fisheries conflict in the East and South China Seas. I apologize in advance, as I am recording this in an active airport. Writing in the Washington Post in 2017, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, General James Sterrett, and Johan Bergenes, now Senior Vice President of Oceans at the World Wildlife Fund, warned the fishing wars are coming, particularly in ocean areas of declining fish stocks, intense fishing pressure, and geopolitical competition, areas like the East and South China Seas. While they did not specifically mention climate change, academics and policymakers are concerned climate change will lead to armed conflicts over marine resources. The recently released IPCC Working Group 2 report cites changing migratory patterns for fish as a potential catalyst for transboundary management conflicts. This map, taken from a co-authored 2020 article in Marine Policy, overlays projections regarding anticipated changes in catch potential, expressed in dollar terms, by 2050 due to climate change for the world's exclusive economic zones, as well as the frequency of militarized disputes between states over these resources from 1993 to 2010. Of particular concern are the East and South China Seas. All the region's major fishing nations are expected to be negatively affected by climate change, and security relationships between many regional players are already quite tense, both generally and with respect to fisheries. But none of the now dozens of articles and press reports discussing climate change and its future impacts demonstrate past effects of climate on fisheries conflict, which would be important for establishing prima facie evidence that concerns about future impacts are warranted. Most IR scholars have treated fisheries disputes as a nuisance at worst and as a footnote in the context of pre-existing diplomatic tensions at best. Our limited goal here is to demonstrate plausible effects of climate on fisheries conflict in the past, with specific emphasis on ocean regions where ENSO/El Nino effects for fisheries productivity are well established and geopolitical tensions between adjacent countries are already high. To do so, we first had to measure militarized fisheries conflict. We used machine learning and natural language processing to parse the militarized interstate dispute database, the most widely used data source on international conflict, for those conflicts involving fisheries resources and/or policing of territorial waters and EEZs. We then augmented the text mining-based exercise with trained human coders. This exercise resulted in 174 instances of militarized, violent conflict over fisheries resources involving sovereign states. These events range from boarding, arrests, and vessel confiscations or vessel scuttling to naval engagements resulting in hundreds of deaths. Fatal events were about 8% of the total. To assess the impact of climate, we investigated the effect of the El Niño Southern Oscillation, a warming-cooling cycle in the Pacific that is the strongest source of interannual variability in the global climate system, with broad impacts for both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. We theorized that militarized fisheries disputes would be more likely to occur in the Pacific Ocean during El Niños, because El Niños cause contractions and declines in fish catch and commercial fisheries in the Pacific, but more specifically, in relevant fisheries for the region. Briefly, we did not find global effects or entirely consistent effects for the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. While we used rigorous panel estimators to test our conjectures, the most important pattern is immediately evident in the raw data. While only half of the years in our sample were El Niño years, nearly 70% of militarized fisheries disputes involving East and South China Sea adjacent countries occurred during those El Niño years. Relative to the baseline probability of occurrence, militarized fisheries disputes are roughly 3 times as likely during El Niños in the East and South China Seas. So, there's good evidence to suggest that global climate has shaped conflict over fisheries in the past, which helps further establish the case that effective transboundary management will be necessary under a changing climate, particularly for peace and cooperation in East and Southeast Asia. This analysis does not parse causal mechanisms. One general challenge facing climate conflict research is the varied and numerous mechanisms by which climate may affect conflict behavior. This issue continues to characterize the debate after nearly 2 decades. A plausible mechanism linking ENSO to MFDs in the Pacific Ocean, and East and South China Seas in particular, is scarcity. El Niños reduce fisheries productivity in these regions, and consequently violent competition over these resources becomes more likely, especially in areas of limited or contested governance, such as the oceans. However, there are other potential mechanisms. ENSO events could affect terrestrial economies in ways that deepen dependence on fisheries-based livelihoods, resulting in intensification of fishing effort that might reinforce the more direct effects of fisheries abundance. In sum, the evidence suggests that El Niño, a significant driver of global climate variability from year to year, is associated with militarized conflict over fisheries in the East and South China Seas, an ocean region of vast geostrategic significance and in which diplomatic tensions are already high. Future work will need to address the potential channels for resolving these conflicts peacefully. Thank you very much for bearing with me.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Glasser. I'm the director of the Secure Fisheries program at One Earth Future Foundation. Secure Fisheries is based in the Somali region, and we work on fisheries conflict and solutions to that conflict through fisheries cooperative management, policy development, and education. I'm going to talk to you today about a project building a fisheries conflict event database. That research was led by Secure Fisheries Research Associate Colleen Devlin and was recently published in the Journal of Peace Research. So we decided to investigate the causes and consequences of fisheries conflict around the Horn of Africa and East Africa by creating an event database derived from media reports. And we defined fisheries conflict as an incident in which a fisheries resource is contested, disputed, or the source of conflict between a minimum of 2 actors. The database spans 6 countries: Tanzania, Kenya, Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, and Yemen, and covers 1990 to 2017. And the map you can see here shows all of the fisheries conflict events that we identified during this time period, with larger dots being areas or fisheries conflicts that were more violent. Over 60% of the conflicts were in Kenya and the Somali region, and about 20% of them were in Tanzania. The conflicts really spiked in the late 2000s, potentially correlating, or most likely correlating, with the height of piracy around the Horn of Africa and the Somali region. Although a lot of those conflicts are really driven by events that were happening in Kenya. Some of those were spillover effects from piracy in the Somali region. And zooming in on what happened in the Somali region during that time, we've identified 3 clusters of fisheries conflict events. In the late 1990s, the conflict was primarily between domestic Somali fishing boats and foreign boats that were fishing illegally in Somali waters. As a result of some of that illegal fishing, pirate attacks against fishing vessels and later other types of commercial vessels became prevalent, leading to another pulse or grouping of conflict in the mid-2000s. International warships also became involved as they were deployed to fight piracy in the Somali region and frequently fired on fisheries, on fishing boats, mistakenly identifying them as pirate threats. And finally, with the waning of Somali piracy in the late 2000s, there was a resurgence again of conflict between foreign and domestic vessels. A wide variety of actors were involved in the conflict. Only about 1 in 5 of the actors were domestic fishers, 14% were foreign fishers, and the rest were a variety of different types of security forces. We were really interested in the drivers or causes of that conflict. And the number one cause was formal or informal limitations on fishing grounds, meaning boundaries such as marine parks, EEZs, or traditional fishing areas. Illegal fishing was the second primary cause of conflict in the region. And then the presence of foreign fishers, which is not always illegal and therefore separate from our illegal fishing driver, the third. The fourth most common cause was weak governance, or the inability of governments to enforce or plan properly for management. Piracy, a notable cause of conflict in the region, was only the fifth most common cause. And interestingly, one of our hypotheses was that a decline in fish stocks would cause fisheries conflict. But changes in fish populations and greater environmental or ecological changes were not one of the major causes, only the sixth and eighth major cause of fisheries conflict in the region. We looked at the consequences of that conflict, about 4,000 arrests, quite a few abductions, not just from pirates, but also after civil wars and by rebel groups. Almost 500 fatalities resulted from fisheries conflict during this time. We wanted to try to understand more what was causing these conflicts. And so we classified the individual drivers, things like weak governance or ground limitations, poverty or food insecurity, and changes in fish stocks into 3 larger categories: management-driven, socioeconomic drivers, and ecological drivers. We likewise classified the types of governance systems around fisheries in the countries we studied, classifying as top-down Eritrea, Djibouti, and Yemen, as minimal Somalia, and as a form of cooperative management between the government and local fishing communities, the kind of management that's common in Kenya and Tanzania. And what we found is that in top-down or minimal governance areas, that management conflicts or socioeconomic conflicts were prevalent, whereas all 3 types of conflicts were about equally prevalent in co-management regions. And we believe that this is because as co-management helps solve some of the conflicts that are very specifically related to fisheries management, that ecological stressors rise to the fore. So that leads me to my conclusions. First, the presence of the international community, primarily in the form of foreign fishers or international navies, is one of the major causes of fisheries conflict in the EEZs around the Horn of Africa. Secondly, that the form of fisheries governance in a country may play a role in the type of fisheries conflict that they see. I think this is an area rich for further research. And third, that ecological drivers of conflict may emerge in more stable nations or those with cooperative forms of fisheries governance. Thank you very much for your interest, and I look forward to the presentations from our panelists and discussants.
Hello everyone, my name is Maurice Obaseng, a research associate at the University of Sheffield Institute for Global Sustainable Development. I was invited to briefly talk about the impact of securitization of fisheries enforcement in Cameroon. I will quickly do this by presenting Cameroon fisheries sector, highlighting its importance and maritime security challenges, discuss securitization as an enforcement mechanism and its impact on fishing and cooperative governance. Cameroon is centrally located in the Gulf of Guinea, between Nigeria and Equatorial Guinea. Her coastline is relatively short, and the maritime area also small. Her position in the Gulf of Guinea makes more productive due to the weak currents and operating system therein. In terms of marine fisheries production by subsector, we can see that the artisanal sector has been the dominant sector since the 1950s. There's a growing industrial sector. 2019 figures put marine fisheries production at 266,000 tons. 45% of catch were small pelagics. These are central for food security and livelihoods in Cameroon and the region beyond. You can see that in terms of employment, the marine fisheries sector, a 2009 firm survey estimated 35,000 fishers distributed in different professions as shown in the figure above. What is striking is that the sector is dominated by migrant fishers from Nigeria, Ghana, Benin, and Togo. 2019 figures shows a significant increase of 53,500, but the distribution remains the same, with migrant fishers still making the dominant population. There's also a growing artisanal fishing fleet of 127,000 vessels. Industrial fishing vessels registered in Cameroon are 70. That was 2019 figures as well. But in the last few years, we have seen increased Cameroon flat EU vessels, which was not the case before. This is a new phenomenon which I'm also currently investigating at the moment. In terms of the sector's contribution to GDP, it was 3%. In 2019, with the GDP budget estimated at US $39 billion. Despite its importance, the fisheries in Cameroon face enormous challenges. In a recent article, I had demonstrated that EU fishing and EU fishing are closely interlinked, and they pose significant environmental, economic, and human security challenges, which have far-reaching consequences on national security. With these challenges, the government has embarked on a robust governance response framed within the broader maritime security governance architecture that now operates in the Gulf of Guinea. Again, in another article, and Malcolm have assessed the evolution of this process and labeled blue securitization. When we have the so-called Yaoundé architecture, which is a regional, sub-regional, and national maritime security governance arrangement, where key stakeholders, key actors within the region have labeled some threats as posing, some issues as posing existential threat to national security, and have now adopted urgency, extraordinary measures to contain the threats. For Cameroon, within the fishery sector, we have new legal instruments, institutional mechanisms, and structural mechanisms to operationalize these legal institutional mechanisms. Key among these are the buffer zones around coastal infrastructures, and increased military practices such as drills, ID checks, arrest and detention, especially of fishers suspected of violating such zones. What are the implications of this on fishing and governance? Currently, Cameroon maritime sector is a hive of oil and gas exploitation activities. We have companies like Adax Petroleum, Chinese company, the New Age Limited, which are prospecting and drilling for oil and gas in different areas in the maritime. And you recall that these areas are buffered, 3 nautical miles around oil installations, or floating vessels, and 7 nautical mile radius around, say, the coastal oil refinery in Limbe. Yeah. What this means is that there's a reduction of inshore fishing zones. You are criminalized. Fishers are criminalized if they venture into institutions. If you talk to military officers, they always evoke the fisher piracy nexus, that they don't know who they are dealing with. So everybody has to be detained. Sometimes fishers indicate that they are detained without due process, imprisoned. They also note that there's a privatization of industrial fishers, which is worrying. So they are able now to fish without scrutiny as it is given to artisanal fishers. And what this means for governance is that military officers have taken a central role, while the role of non-military officers or subnational actors are less or sidelined. And then there's exclusion of CSOs in fisheries governance activities. So essentially, we see that secularization and militarization of fisheries has impact disproportionately on small-scale fishers, reducing fishing access and catch, and setting and security reins, arbitrary arrest and detention. Agency and capacity of non-military state actors is really sidelined. I think there is need to rethink efforts to address fisheries challenges, as an issue of social and environmental justice, targeting industrial fishers and prioritizing small-scale fishers. Thank you, and hopefully we'll have discussions on this later. Thank you very much.
Good morning. The presentation today is about the impacts of overfishing in the East and South China Seas, two areas where territorial disputes have been ongoing for a long time. I will show what socio-economic benefits fisheries provide and why achieving regional cooperation in fisheries management is so important for protecting biodiversity and societal well-being in these two regions. The South and East China Seas are two large marine ecosystems in Asia that border some of the world's most populous countries. While I won't get into detail about the territorial disputes, these two maps show where the overlapping claims by different countries occur. The South and East China Seas countries depend on fisheries for supporting their culture, traditions, as well as food, nutrition, employment, and livelihoods. These two LMEs are some of the world's most important and productive fishing grounds, where we can see the South China Sea produces about 10% of global fisheries catch, whereas the East China Sea contributes about 5%. Many of the commercially important species are migratory and also spawn across international borders, making cooperative fisheries management very important. Landed value from fisheries is between 7 to 15 billion US dollars per year. And while contribution to national GDP isn't very high, fisheries are still really important for supporting livelihoods and coastal communities because across these two large marine ecosystems, about upwards of 4.5 million people are employed. The majority of them are small-scale fishers, so this underlines the importance of fisheries in providing for coastal livelihoods. Fish consumption is also very high across South and East China Sea countries and exceeds the average global fish consumption of 20.5 kilos per person per year. But all these fisheries benefits are at risk of being lost because of the heavy overexploitation, which puts the future sustainability of fisheries at risk. These two graphs show that the proportion of overexploited and collapsed fish stocks have been increasing over time. Excessive fishing capacity is widespread, and the deteriorating state of fisheries has intensified competition for fisheries resources, and this has driven illegal and destructive fishing practices, which is exacerbated by the provision of economic incentives such as fuel subsidies. Coastal development from the region's rapidly expanding economies, as well as pollution, has further destroyed many vulnerable habitats such as mangroves, seagrasses, and coral reefs. Many high-value species have become locally depleted due to the intense fishing pressure, and the loss of large demersal species has transformed marine food webs, so that fishing down the food web has become apparent in both the East and South China Sea. This has shifted the fishing industry to focus on what is called feed-grade fishing, which is capturing fish, very small fish that were formerly discarded. due to their low value, but are now in demand for use as fish feed in the agriculture industry. On top of all these anthropogenic threats, climate change is expected to have negative impacts on the biomass as well as catch diversity of fish stocks in the East and South China Seas. So what does all this mean in the context of maritime conflicts? Territorial disputes have further driven overfishing and is a barrier to large marine ecosystem-wide fisheries management. There's currently no multilateral agreement that covers all the South and East China Sea countries, even though bilateral agreements exist. This means that national efforts to rebuild depleted fish stocks may be wasted if not all the countries participating in managing fish stocks have an interest. So what can be done to encourage regional cooperation? Using sustainable fisheries as a common goal can be one strategy to bypass conflicts over sovereignty. Non-political and non-state-driven forums can be used, for example, workshops for data sharing and stock assessments that are facilitated by academic institutions or by non-profit organizations such as the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, bring together scientists as well as fisheries officers from the different South China Sea countries. And there have also been proposals to establish a marine peace park in disputed areas. And all of these efforts can be used to bypass the current deadlock over political tensions over disputed areas. So in summary, the main message that I want to convey in this presentation is that fisheries are crucial to the people and economies of the South and East China Seas. However, regional cooperation is currently lacking for fisheries management, but is really important to achieve in order to prevent further loss of biodiversity and loss of economic and social benefits from East and South China Sea fisheries. To this end, sustainable fisheries can be used as a common goal to bypass sovereignty issues and to encourage regional cooperation by all countries within the South and East China Sea's large marine ecosystems. So I'd like to end with some acknowledgements, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you all for the presentation. That was great. So I'll be very briefly introducing the discussants now. So we're really privileged to have Dr. Christian Berger with us. He's a professor at the University of Copenhagen in international relations. Some of you may have read his work if you've have been interested in so-called blue crimes or maritime security. He's also one of the directors of the Safe Seas Network of Marine Security Research. And as I mentioned, as I was concluding my own talk, he has a number of papers, one of which is not yet published, but it's available through the SSRN, is on ocean governance paradigms. We also have the chance of having Lol Dalet, and Lol is a PhD student at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research. She's currently in Brazil on fieldwork. I hope the internet will work. She said it may be a little bit difficult. And she has published a really good paper, doing a lead review on fisheries conflicts, and really considering them also as our conflicts can really help with actually bringing transformational change that can be positive as well. And that's something that many people studying conflicts from a political ecology perspective stress. It's important sometimes to have those conflicts rather than let people being dispossessed and displaced, etc. So I'll invite Christian maybe to go first.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and also allowing me to comment very quickly on these all stellar research papers and presentations. What clearly emerges is how important fishery is as a source of insecurity and how it cuts across different dimensions. Now, I was asked to zoom out a little bit and comment on the papers and presentations from the perspective of the maritime security paradigm. As was just highlighted, there are different paradigms of how we think and govern the oceans, and maritime security is one of them. Now, what is maritime security actually? Quite obviously, as a paradigm, it has a lot of internal contestation, and it means different things to different people, and it is very often dependent on securitization acts, but also on the question of where you sit and how you relate it to other concepts. Now, in our readings, and that's largely a joint work with Tim Edmonds, we think that maritime security has three key dimensions. And the first one is a state dimension, and here we're talking about interstate disputes over territory, over resources, fish being one of the most prevalent ones. But we are also talking here about the emergence of gray zone warfare, and fishing fleets, as we have learned, have a lot to do with that. The second dimension is actually terrorism or extremist violence at sea, and this often does not get a lot of attention, but once you start looking for it, there's actually a lot of incidents, either in terms of direct attacks on maritime installations, on shipping vessels, or in terms of spillover of violent extremism at land into the sea. And the most paradigmatic one here is perhaps the Yemen conflict, which had quite a significant impact on shipping activities. Now, the third one is the category of blue crime. And blue crime, here we are distinguishing between three of them. And the first one are criminal flows, and it's mainly smuggling of narcotics, weapons, people, and so on. The second are blue crimes on maritime shipping, and here we're talking mainly about piracy, it has been mentioned a couple of times. And then last but not least, environmental crime. And this is quite obviously where IUU fishing, or I prefer the term illicit fisheries, actually for various reasons, where this fits in. But when we're talking about environmental crime at sea, we should not only talk about illicit fisheries, but also about pollution and dumping and so on. Now, how does fish fit into this picture? I think what we have seen from all of these presentations, what is fascinating about fishery and fishery conflict, it cuts across these three dimensions that I have just outlined. We haven't heard that much about violent extremism and whether there's an impact on that, but it's relatively straightforward. Fisheries is quite significant in terms of interstate disputes, and it's quite significant in terms of either being an environmental crime per se or being a facilitating crime. Now, why are we actually talking about fish, and why is fisheries so prominent both on the ocean governance agenda, but I'm always puzzled by how much attention is actually given to fisheries these days, and the panel documents that nicely. So that is a question that to allow us to zoom out a little bit and reflect on why is it fish that we are all concerned about. And I think there's something very, very peculiar about fish and fisheries. It was mentioned a little bit in the introduction as well. I think there are 5 key dimensions here. And the first one is that fish and fisheries are in many ways paradigmatic for this idea that the ocean has unlimited resources, and over the last decades we are recognizing that this is no longer the case. But however, our policy and governance frameworks are still built on the assumption that there would be this abundance of fisheries. So that's the first thing what makes it peculiar, I think. The second one is quite obviously that fish are mobile. They don't really pay attention to our territorialization attempts, to our boundaries, and so on. And that in particular concerns the high value species. The third peculiarity, I think, is the link between fishery and what we call today the blue economy. And in many ways, fishery are paradigmatic for this blue economy fantasy. And I do think that the blue economy is in many ways a fantasy, because for me, the idea that you can actually put together exploitation and conservation, in one approach is very, very difficult to reconcile. It's just a basic tension, and I have my doubts that that management technologies actually can address that. And here, fish again is paradigmatic. However, the disputes between France and the UK was highlighted before. I think there's also something else at stake, because if you look at this Anglo-French fishery disputes, this is not about economic value. The economic value of fisheries is absolutely marginal. So there's something symbolic about fish as well, something historically grown symbolism that makes fish so particular. And I think this we also really need to pay attention to. And if it's the UK, the case in the UK and France, quite obviously it is also the case elsewhere. And this is also then a little bit a trap for our own research attempts. A lot of kind of like research papers start with these economic estimations and so on. But is that really what is at stake in these conflicts, or is it much more about the economic value, the symbolic value, rather than the economic value or food security? The last peculiarity brings me right towards the beginning of my short comment here, and that's the observation that fish intersects all of the maritime security dimensions. It is, in particular, illicit fisheries, and I think that comes very nicely out of the research, is a facilitating crime to start with. So just think about the link between narcotic smuggling and illicit fisheries, but then also the increasing role of fishing vessels in gray zone activities. There's fantastic research, for instance, on the Iranian fishing fleet, clearly showing how Iran also uses this as a tool for influencing. So I think that is the kind of like then the fifth peculiarity, that fishery somehow connects all of these issues in a fascinating way to each other. So I hope you found this comment useful and interesting. It was an exercise in zooming out a little bit and also connecting the presentations. And I leave it here, and I very much look forward to the responses, comments, and questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. Lol, I see you clearly, so I hope the audio will be following through too. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say that it's an honor for me to take part to this webinar and to be able to engage discussion on this fascinating topic. So thank you to Professor Le Billon for the invitation. I hope you can hear me clearly, otherwise just let me know. So we've seen various thought-provoking presentations that leave us with many interrogations, I hope. For example, we're probably hardly optimistic about how can such great amount of fisheries conflict and of great intensity be resolved. Or I wonder if beyond a punctual resolution, could fisheries conflicts actually serve as springboards for some sort of positive outcomes to be achieved? This question will be the guiding thread of my discussion. I will structure it in 3 parts that I hope take up some key messages from the panelists' presentations. So first, I would like to summarize some commonalities and different dynamics we heard about and that help to understand fisheries conflicts. Second, I will consider existing options to manage different types of conflicts. And finally, I will discuss how, in my opinion, positive outcomes might be achieved through a transformative conflict management approach. So then let me jump straight to part one. In the presentations, conflicts were described in many ways, including in terms of causes, actors, intensity of the conflict or way they manifest, and levels at which the conflicts take place. We heard from the panelists that a variety of conflict drivers exist, such as climate change, the presence of foreign fleets or outsiders, illegal fishing and piracy, weak governance, and conflicts with other sectors, such as oil and gas activities, among others. And with the intensification of climate change and the expansion of activities linked to the blue economy agenda, which also raises concerns linked to social justice issues, further and deeper marine environments will be exploited, which can increase the potential for new conflicts to arise. And new conflicts may arise, but also ongoing conflicts can evolve due to this changing marine context, and there can be sort of feedback processes that in this conflict. So this was, for example, illustrated in Dr. Maurice Obaseng's talk, where the securitization and militarization of Cameroon's maritime environment negatively impacts small-scale fishers, and this in turn might further create conflicts or exacerbate the already existing ones. But if marine conflicts share similarities in many parts of the world, I would also like to note that their configuration and the way they evolve are very much dependent on the social, economic, cultural, and political context in which they are embedded. I find it interesting to think about both the unique and context-dependent features of a given conflict, as well as to seek ways to identify common patterns across different levels, from local to global. For example, Dr. Sahas-Glazer's presentation shows that different types of fishing governance might have an impact on the type of fisheries conflicts that arise in each country, but also on the way they are handled, with repercussions in the whole region of the Horn of Africa. And this brings me to my second point, motivated by a common denominator among the panelists, that cooperative approach to fishing management can help opening the path for an effective conflict management. And this is all the more important in the context where the distribution of fish stocks is shifting due to a change in marine environment, as pointed by Dr. Cullen Hendricks, or when conflicts involve many different stakeholders with different political power. In fisheries, conflicts are typically managed through fisheries management authorities, the judicial system, for example, courts and tribunals, and customary systems, or a combination of those. And these can work together to allow for spaces where stakeholders can communicate, share, and negotiate their knowledge and values. There are successful examples of outcomes to manage conflicts, such as transboundary fisheries arrangements or co-management arrangements. For example, here in Brazil, in the Amazonian coast where I am now. However, several challenges remain when it comes to ensuring a balanced participation of all stakeholders affected by the conflict and a shared vision of the desired outcomes of this process, among others. Thus, fisheries conflict management is still too often limited to a rather technocratic and punctual solution that often do not fit local contexts, which creates or may exacerbate further conflicts. And my third and last point introduces the idea that conflicts may be used as springboards to advance social justice, in line with the argument of Dr. Maurice Obaseng. This implies recognizing the underlying structural factors that feed chronic social conflicts. Examples of these factors are political interests that prioritize the industrial fishing sector, including through harmful fishery subsidies. That was pointed out, for example, by Dr. Louis Sterrett, And it is also the case in Latin America and West Africa, for example. Also, top-down environmental governance is likely to perpetuate management-related conflicts, as pointed out again by Dr. Sarah Glasser. And to a broader extent, we can mention the neoliberal logic that indefinitely tends to exhaust marine resources and perpetuate the marginalization of groups of artisanal fishers. Now, addressing these issues looks like a very huge task. It is indeed, I think, but small steps can already represent major advancements. For example, opportunities and inclusive spaces can be created where creative solutions might be jointly elaborated. One example of such space is the non-political and non-state-driven forum proposed by Dr. Louis Tay for the East and South China Sea case. Also, social movements and the civil society are key actors to open up new spaces of resistance and transformation, both at the local and global levels. And finally, I would argue that the existing legal system should also be reinvested in debates as well as in practice, with the responsibility to undertake and support such a transformational approach. And with that, I thank you very much for the attention, and